Please note that in this show, you may hear graphic descriptions or language that may not be appropriate for everyone. Listener discretion advised.
So this is a poem that my father, Marky Smith, wrote in his 20s when he was in grad school, called Open Thy Heart. The pain and the hurt which is buried inside, the freedom to love which thy pain has denied. Open thy soul, letting the warmth filter in, giving all a chance for love to win. Believing and trusting, for it will not betray. Open thy heart and give love a place to lay.
Welcome to Parentless Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rilliford. On this show, we're going to be speaking with others who have experienced the loss of one or both of their parents or parental figures. As we heard in episode 12 with Louisa Velarde, being parentless is like an island, and I don't know how to swim. Thank you for being my life jacket.
Hey everyone, my name's Emily Smith. I just turned 24 about 3 weeks ago, and I'm an adult orphan. I lost my mother and my father by the age of 23. I'm currently a clinical master's of social work student, and I'm currently doing social work for special needs families.
Thank you so much, Emily, for visiting us at Parentless Podcast. We're so excited to have you here. Who died for you? Who is your person?
So my mother, Lori J. Smith, passed away in October 2020, so about 5 months ago. And I feel like last time me and Steph talked, I actually wasn't as vulnerable and raw as I wanted to be, partially because I feel like there's a lot of stigma surrounding topics that my mom's death, kind of has to do with. And I think, being so young and it being so fresh, it's definitely kind of a new experience for me. And it's been really hard to kind of talk about my mother in this way. But essentially, I don't know how my mother died. No idea. She battled addiction for many, many, many years. She had a lot of mental health issues. She had a diagnosis of bipolar and depression and, like I said, battled addiction. And we had a very rocky relationship for about as long as I can remember. She was a decent mother, when I was a little kid, but she kind of went downhill when I was about 10, and we had a really rocky relationship since.
When did she pass away? What was the date?
She passed away October 1st, 2020. Trigger warning here, I guess, just in case for anyone listening. She was found in her apartment by her, caretaker at the time, who no one heard from her in about 2 days. The caretaker went over and found her. And so on the scene, they presume that she probably was, passed for about 2 or 3 days at that point.
How did you find out?
I received a phone call from the caretaker. It was funny because I was about 5 minutes away from running my first ever therapeutic support group as, a clinical student, therapist student. And so I'm like getting ready, to kind of help all these other people. And I got this phone call, and she totally calmly too. I don't know if she was in shock or what, but she was just like, hey, so I found your mother dead. And I like burst out into tears. And then, she's like passing the phone around, and the police are there, and the EMTs are trying to get my information. And like all of this is happening, and I can like barely get a word out. It was a rough time.
So word for anybody who has to call someone and give them the news. Is there like a better way to do that? I mean, I know it's horrible. It's not easy, but
no, but I feel like just being aware that that's going to be shocking news for anyone, right? Especially if it's like a super close loved one. Like you can show some compassion and empathy in your voice. It's okay.
Tell me what happened next after, how did you get through your therapy session? What did you do with that?
Oh, I didn't. I immediately called up my supervisor and I said, hey, I just found out my mom passed away. I cannot do this. And that was in another state. I live in Virginia. My mom was in Pennsylvania. I was like, I need to go. And she was like, totally understood. Go. And the next morning I drove to Pennsylvania, and yeah.
So just backstory here. Your father was already passed away. And so do you have siblings?
I do not. I grew up as an only child. I have a stepsister now because my father remarried, but that's obviously no correlation to my mother. So yeah, I grew up as an only child.
Okay. So you were the one in charge then when your mom passed away. So you had to make that trip, drive down there, and then take care of things.
I mean, great question. It was kind of a blur at that point. I mean, I already did it with my father, and I'm like, here we go again. But so I think the hardest part, even before we dive into that, is that, my mom's death is still kind of a bunch of unknowns. They originally ruled it as a homicide, and then they ruled it as a suicide, which actually to me makes a lot of sense just based on my mother's, mental health diagnoses in the past. She had multiple suicide attempts before really struggled with her mental health. And then ultimately the system kind of failed me. I feel like they were just like, listen, like, I don't know. They just kind of ruled it unknown causes. Her death certificate pretty much just says that her cause of death was literally all of her different diagnoses. So like her disability that she had, all of her mental health diagnoses. Yeah. I like called the police department a bunch of times, never called me back. The coroner's office never did an autopsy. And so then by the time they transported her to the funeral home, I was like, what about an autopsy? And they wanted me to pay $6,000 out of pocket for an outside autopsy. Obviously, no 23-year-old has that money. Didn't happen. I never got a confirmed toxicology report back. Like, my mother's death is just unknown.
Like you said, we talked before and you want to be more open about it. So talk to me about your mom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so much easier to just tell people, yeah, she passed away of a heart attack or just, natural causes. And that's what I've done for the past 5 months to everyone. Even my stepmom, I was just like, yep, cardiac arrest, moving on. When in reality, there's so many unknowns and they didn't even bother to look into that. And I think part of me has been trying to push that down a little bit, right? Of like, the system failed me, but I just got to move forward. But now I'm kind of inching towards that half a year mark. And it's kind of starting to peak up a little bit. I've been trying to suppress it, but now it's kind of floating back up. And so part of it is that I think my gut instinct truly said that she either died by suicide or she overdosed accidentally or something like that. There's just so many parts of my mother's death that don't add up. When I went to clean out her apartment a few days later, her entire fridge was full of alcohol bottles and not a single drop of food. And she never really ate anyway. She was a very tiny woman. She was like 4'11", like 100 pounds soaking wet. But like maybe like 50 alcohol bottles just like loaded in her fridge. But the police took her phone, all of her medications, and I never got in contact with the police after that. They never called me back. I never got any of her possessions back. There's just so much that didn't add up about it. And I just, it kind of eats at me sometimes. I get really angry. I feel like that's the emotion that I'm currently sitting with, right? Is that anger and that resentment for the fact that I'll never truly know what happened to my mother, even if we didn't have that close of a relationship.
Yeah. I mean, so I know this isn't possible, but I feel like I want to start calling the police department for you.
Go for it.
Is there any particular smell, sight, taste, sound that just reminds you of your mom?
It's a tricky one. Yeah, I mean, her favorite flower, orchids. So I actually have an orchid that my stepmother gave me when she passed. So I still have that on my windowsill. So anytime I see orchids, that reminds me of her. She very much loved Bon Jovi, was total fangirl about Bon Jovi for as long as I can remember growing up. I can hear a Bon Jovi song and be like, not this again, because I listened to it so much when I was a toddler, kind of growing up. But yeah, she was really into Bon Jovi. She really loved horses. She used to ride before she got really sick. So that was, horses, things like that kind of remind me of her. But, we had such a strained relationship. Her and my father got divorced when I want to say 11 or 12. And after that, we just didn't really speak much. Or when we did, I was just, I had a lot of anger and resentment towards her, and especially in my teenage years. A lot of traumatic things happened between the ages of 10 and 12 for me in terms of mental health and, things that happened in our household. And so our relationship was really strained. And it's hard to, look back and think of my mother in a good light at all, or say, oh yeah, this cooking smell reminds me of her, because she didn't cook for me,
So you mentioned that your stepmother, right? Is she still around?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Was she a big help for you in the loss of your mom?
Oh, absolutely. She even offered to drain her savings account and pay for the autopsy. It's you can't do that. You're a widow. Please don't do that. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm very, very lucky in the fact that, yes, I'm 23 without biological parents, but I, somehow, got lucky enough to have a stepmother who's just as involved and loves me as much as, my biological parents would. I think a huge part of it for me in kind of my journey so far with my mom's death is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's so much stigma around suicide and mental health and addiction. And I was part of that stigma for a very long time. I mean, I still am in a way, when you're kind of training to be a therapist or any type of mental health worker, you take what's called the implicit bias test. And with that, it's basically, this test that, this questionnaire that you take that helps you see these biases that you have every day, even though you may not realize them. And, looking back, even from when I was like 12, versus now, I've always kind of had that resentment and that anger and that bias towards my mother of, she was her diagnosis. She was this addict in this, bipolar monster in a way. And that's kind of the view I had of her for so long. And so her death really changed that for me. When she passed away and her sister's like, oh, here's a box of all these writings she did growing up, and kind of seeing this whole other side of my mom that I never personally got to experience. And so, I look back now and I wish I had the compassion and the empathy and the vulnerability that I do now to give that to her before she passed away.
That's a hard line to deal with, because now you're left thinking about that and like, oh, well, what else could I have done? What could I have done differently? I should have been, but we can't change this. And that's a really hard thing. Like when you were little, I believe you told me before that things were different when you were little, right? Was there like a turning point that you kind of remember?
Yeah. So based on stories that I've heard, with my small family. Yeah, I was originally born in Martinez, California. That's where my parents lived at the time. And so when I was like a little, baby and a toddler, everything was totally fine. I've heard she was a great mother. Like there's pictures of me laughing and us hanging out. But then my father got a really, really amazing, great job in Pennsylvania. And so they moved across country from California to Pennsylvania. And apparently that's when it all just kind of went downhill. I don't know if it was the move and, maybe being in a new environment where she didn't know anyone, but she totally isolated herself. She kind of fell down the internet, and like there's a whole story with that I won't say on this podcast, but she, kind of was super drawn to being on the internet all the time and talking to strangers, if you catch my drift a little bit.
Something that we haven't said here, I believe you told me that she did not communicate.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Yes. Right? Yeah. Please remind me if I forget things. Like
I'm in no place to remind. I'm kind of pulling from my little memory here. But yeah, that makes complete sense. The internet is a place where you can communicate and you don't have to be able to verbally speak.
Yeah, I guess I should probably mention that, huh? Because I know you can edit this in. Yeah, so my mother, both my parents had disabilities, and we'll get to my dad, obviously. But my mom had a neurological disease called dystonia that, affects your nerves and your muscles and coordination and things like that. And back in the 70s, it was, a really big unknown for this disease. And so she actually had a few brain surgeries, and one of the brain surgeries went horrifically wrong, and they cut a weird part of her brain or something. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but essentially she lost her ability to talk. And so my mom verbally could not communicate since she was like 5. So, I grew up with a mom who could not verbally communicate, and she didn't know sign language because the coordination was too hard. So what she would do is, at the time she had like a old school typewriter that she would type things out that she wanted to say, or, as technology advanced, she would use her phone, or the neat part. And I've never understood this, never will now, but my father could totally read her air writing. So my mom would spell out letters and words with her finger in the air, but it would be backward to you or me because she would be doing it facing herself. So she would make an L, right? To her, it would be an L, but it would be backwards to anyone who's trying to, look at her and watch it. But my father had it down. Like she could spell anything. He'd be like, oh yeah, this is what she said. And I could never pick it up. I was never good at it.
Word spell me one word. I'll see if I can do it.
Okay. Trying to think what's a good.
I think I got STU maybe.
Nope.
That's really what I got.
See, it's hard.
See, I thought you were going to do my name. Maybe that's what you did. I don't know.
I was doing Starbucks because I have a Starbucks drink next to me.
I totally do too. Yeah, that's super hard. Wow. So props to your dad. And you said you were never able to really get that. So how, and the typewriter thing, and then her phone. I'm just wondering how she communicated with you mostly, especially when you were little.
Yeah, I think part of it, and even with my dad, when we talk about that, is that just, I feel like I've always kind of had this innate ability to just understand my parents. I mean, they used to joke about, right, how when I was a baby, I would just lay totally still and let them change my diaper. Like I would never fuss. I would never move. Right. And there's these two, this guy with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair and this woman who has really, really terrible, like hand coordination, trying to like change a diaper on a moving baby. And I just kind of was like, no, I know, I'm just going to hang out. Like I've always had that innate ability to understand my parents on that level.
That's awesome. And that's not surprising. I mean, I think there's just ways that things work out. That was one of them. Good thing that they had you for a baby, right?
They were so blessed.
They definitely were. All right. So, is there anything that you want to say regarding like addiction or suicide or anything? I know you don't have any answers on your mom, but I know that those are both two very large topics and people don't really know how to approach them, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, being honest, I'm not sure I know how to approach them yet, given the fact that I think I'm just starting my journey of understanding them. I mean, I know from a clinical lens, right, as someone who's in school right now for that, I think part of it is genuinely realizing that it is truly a disease. That's not the person that you're interacting with, For so many years, I was like, yep, that's my mom. She's an addict and she's, has bipolar and depression and XYZ. But in reality, it was no, there's Lori, there's my mother. And then separately, there's this addiction and this mental health. And I think, as a society, we tend to group them as the same. And that's just one individual when it's not.
Yeah, like you're not your addiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Lori, you mentioned we always like to talk about names. Lori was your mom. Anything else? Now, you said your mom liked tattoos, right? So describe her for me.
My mom was kind of a badass and like she had this weird like edgy vibe to her. And so she liked like certain music and she loved tattoos and I never understood it because I was like, I'm too scared to get a tattoo. I'm never going to get one. But she ended up having like, I want to say it was like 15 different tattoos. Like she had like this really neat half sleeve of this like Pegasus unicorn with all these colors on it. And, every time a family member died, she would get a tattoo in their honor. And she had my name tattooed. And we had 2 bulldogs growing up. She loved animals and she had like their faces tattooed on her. Like anything that was mildly related to her life, she would get a tattoo of. But so when my father passed away, I was like, I'm going to do it. And I finally got my first tattoo. And then I got another tattoo in his honor. So then when my mother passed away, I was like, I have to get a tattoo in her honor. Like, this is just the perfect way to kind of keep her memory alive for me, at least. And so I ended up getting a third tattoo. It's Maya Angelou's Still I Rise poem. So it says Still I Rise. And I have one of the eyes is a semicolon for mental health because I felt like it just, accurately represented kind of her struggles. And I wanted to commemorate that somehow. And then at the end, there's a little abstract orchid on it.
I like that. So, all right. Anything more about your mom that you want to bring up now?
I'm like trying to think. What did we even talk about last time? I don't remember at this point.
A lot of stuff. The death of your mom. How do you feel like your life has been changed?
I mean, it's interesting just because it was already such a complicated relationship. And like, truth be told, I've been mourning and, grieving her in a certain way since I was like 10 and everything kind of went down, and I think a lot of it for me was this anticipatory grief of part of me is honestly kind of surprised she made it to 50. I mean, she passed like 5 days after she turned 50, but I didn't expect her to live that long, And so I think part of it is I have this huge amount of guilt and remorse, and the same thing with my dad, right? But now it's almost this added layer to it now with both parents where I'm just like, I've been alive 23, 24 years now, and I never got to know my mother. And now I have to kind of, navigate and reorient myself to this entire new world where I'll never, ever get the chance to know her. And I think that's been really hard, especially, right, kind of being such a young adult and just entering this world, as a young adult and seeing all of my peers still have mostly both their parents and, having great relationships and being able to have that kind of adult relationship with them. And I'll never get to have that.
Because your father passed away first, and we'll talk about him, but when he passed away, did anything in your head go off like, oh, I need to try to be closer to my mom or try to learn more about her? Anything like that?
Part of it did, but then it was just so hard to connect with her because half the time I wasn't getting Lori, right? I was getting whatever she was battling that day, whether she was, high on medication or maybe she was, in a depressive episode and super depressed. Like she would text me and be like, yeah, I'm just feeling really suicidal and, I'm not feeling too good, but I'm fine. And then I'd have to, call her caretaker up and be like, I need you to go check on her. Or we had a lot of different exchanges where she really, at some point, for some reason, got really fixated on wanting her wedding album when my dad passed away. And the issue with that for me was that she tried to burn the wedding album when she was having a psychotic episode when I was like 11. So I've held on to it all of these years, right? And she really, really wanted this wedding album back. And I was like, I can make copies for you. I can send you send pictures of pictures over, but I am not going to physically give you this wedding album. I'm sorry. And for the next month and a half, that was the only exchange we would have where she would just try to fight me on this wedding album. It was just impossible most of the time to have, a rational interaction or conversation with her. And so that made it incredibly hard for me, right, to want to reach out and be like, hey, Mom, I love you. Let's grab coffee sometime.
Hey there, welcome in. For Mother's Day and Father's Day of 2021, I would love to put a project together, but to do that, I will need your help. If you'd like to participate, here's what you can do. Call 623-396-6069 and leave a voicemail. It can be anonymous. And look, I am a mom, I work, and I just put in my resignation letter as my son's first grade teacher. So no worries, I will not be answering your call. All right, so if you've picked up the phone and called the number, the next step, obviously, is to leave that voicemail you've always been wanting to leave. Parentless Podcast was born out of the idea that we all have questions or something we'd like to tell our parent if we could just pick up the phone and call them one more time. Now, I can't promise that they'll get this message, but you can at least send a voicemail out to the universe for your dead or estranged parent. I believe this will be a powerful display of all of the feelings, questions, comments, I'm sorry's, thank yous, and everything that we might ever wish that we could tell them. If this appeals to you, please call or share with a friend that might find this helpful. This week, I'm teaming up with Missouri author Cindy McIntyre. I spoke with Cindy back in November, and her episodes are 23 and 24. Within those episodes, she talked about her book that was becoming an audiobook. It was a surprise to us. It was a Parentless Podcast exclusive. And now that has happened, we want to work together to give 20 lucky people a taste. Not even just a taste, it's the whole thing. Fill your plate with this great book. Love at the Center of Grief is a YA novel that you really have to check out. And so if you would like to be considered to win this free book on Audible, please let Cindy know. You can let me know as well. I'll get with Cindy. However you want to do that, that's fine. We have 20 of these to give away to 20 lucky people from the US and the UK. Let us know. Thanks.
The reality is I grew up as a caretaker. I mean, my father tried the best that he could when he ended up being a single dad with me when I was 12, right? We made it work. But still, right, I was still a caretaker. I mean, I have literally the only memories that I can genuinely think of right now with my mother are coming home from school and she's, been asleep for the past 6 hours in bed. And I'm like, Mom, you still there? Shaking her awake. And she's all groggy and she would miss family vacation. She never once went on a family vacation with us. There's definitely a couple times where she overdosed. There is a very traumatic trigger warning, I guess, for everyone. A very traumatic experience for me and my dad where she pretty much had a psychotic break and we're we had to, run into his bedroom and lock the door and she's on the other side with the knife trying to get in and she's screaming and we had to call 911 and they came and, took her away to this mental hospital. But these are all the memories growing up that I have of her. Right. And so I was a kid, but I was also a caretaker. I was constantly checking on my mother and making sure she was breathing and she was okay. And, alerting whoever needed to be alerted if something happened. And then, when she left, I was taking care of my father. I mean, he had cerebral palsy. He was in a wheelchair. I was cooking. I was cleaning. I was always in that caretaker role. And so it was weird for me because even in my 20s, when I went off to undergrad, and, my mother is texting me that she's suicidal and not feeling great. I don't necessarily have as empathy or as compassion most of the time, but in those moments, I still did. I still kind of immediately took on that caretaker role of, okay, let me contact her caretaker and get her to check on her. And, I'd get calls about like doctor's appointments because I was her emergency contact. I'd be like, hey, Mom, you have a doctor's appointment tomorrow. Just a reminder. And that's like the only thing I would talk to her about for the next month. Right. But it's weird because, cognitively in those moments, I jumped right back into that role.
And how could you not? I mean, that's what you knew.
Yeah.
How do you feel now, not necessarily having that caretaker role with your parents? Do you find yourself trying to take that on for other people? Now, I know in your schooling and all of that, you're going in to help people, and we'll talk more about that later. But just in general, do you try to help?
Oh, I mean, even when my parents were alive, as soon as I went off to college, I was in the wrong type of relationships with men, right? Men who desperately needed help. It's called codependence, right? When you kind of grow up in this environment like that, you develop this codependency where you feel like you can fix or change people and you'll help them in whatever way you can. And I absolutely had that, especially right when I went off to college. And so that's been something that I've been trying to slowly kind of break since I turned 18 and left for college. I mean, I think I'm finally in a place now where I'm in a actual healthy relationship and I'm not trying to fix or change him. And, we're a pretty equal team. But I mean, even in friendships, right? Everyone has shit. Let's be honest here, right? Everyone goes through shit. Everyone has their shit. But even in friendships, if my best friend's going through something, I'll drop everything and I'll be like, oh, I don't need to go to class. What's up? What do you need right now? Do you need me to drive 6 hours? There's definitely that you put everyone else before yourself. And that's something I'm actively trying to work on, especially now that my parents are gone.
Well, that'll probably be a lifelong thing to work on, but I'm really glad that you're able to work on that and to get started on that. Do you feel like your schooling, has that helped you to work on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, yes, there's definitely been moments where I've been like, oh yeah, that sounds really great. But I also think it's really different when you're the clinician helping someone else do it versus, you yourself doing it, right? We don't always take our own advice.
Exactly.
And I think the other part of it too is that, when you're in school for this type of work, sometimes, honestly, it's like imposter syndrome, right? I'm like, oh, all these other, all my other classmates are going to be these amazing clinicians. Then I'm like, oh God, but I have all my own trauma to work through. And I'm like, oh God, how can I help someone else through their trauma when I have my own trauma? And then it's it all kind of comes to light and you're like, oh God, I can't do this.
So part of your school, I mean, do you go to therapy?
So that's a story we'll talk about.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good.
Yes. I am currently in the middle of finding a new therapist.
All right. Well, I want to hear that story. I don't know if you want to share, but we'll hear that later. Before we get too far into things, let's hear about your dad. What was your dad's name?
Yeah. So my father was Mark Eugene Smith. He passed away from esophageal cancer at 47.
And when did he pass away?
November 25th, 2018. 2 years ago. Yep.
2 years ago.
Yep.
All right. Well, tell me about your dad. We had some fun discussion about him before. Sounds like he was pretty amazing. Before we talk about, I think, his sickness and what happened, let's talk about his life.
Yeah, he was such an amazing man. And I feel like I need to kind of stop for a second and say that I feel like when people pass, we tend to idolize them, right? And so part of my journey has been also realizing that my parents weren't perfect, especially my dad, right? He passed away and I was like, oh, he was such an amazing man. And he was. But he also, right, did things that, weren't always the best or, right, didn't make the right decision all the time. But that almost makes them better in the sense that it shows you that they were making the same mistakes you were, right? I mean, as a 20-something, I can look back and say my dad made the exact same mistake when he was my age, right? He was human, and that makes him 10 times more awesome, I think, than just idolizing him.
So when was he diagnosed with cerebral palsy?
Yeah, so that was at birth. Yeah, so my father essentially, right, the story is that they gave his mom too much epidural. And so then the baby stopped breathing. My father stopped breathing when he came out. And, the lack of oxygen is what caused cerebral palsy. And so he's been in a wheelchair his entire life. And obviously, similar to my mom, he was born in 1971. Right back then in the 70s, I didn't know much about this. And so the doctors were like, hey, I don't think your baby's going to make it. Like, sorry, go home, enjoy time with them, whatever. Obviously, that's not the case with cerebral palsy, right? It's not a progressive condition of any kind. He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't walk. He, had muscle spasms. Coordination was kind of poor. Sometimes he had slurred speech, that kind of thing. But yeah, so, right, he leaves the hospital as a baby and they're like, this kid's not going to live. And my dad lived to be 47 and he lived this incredible life. He, came from a family of poverty and alcoholism, and he had 2 siblings and they all kind of grew up in this, traumatic childhood and household where they weren't really cared for by their parents. And, I think a lot of people with trauma, right, we don't have this realization about it and, that we need to work through and heal from it and figure out, where it fits in our life as adults until later on in life. And my dad knew that by the time he was like 15. He was actually one of the first children to be put in mainstream schools in the 70s in the county that he lived in because he advocated for himself. He was in a special education classroom and he was like, I don't need this. Like, I'm totally fine. Just because I'm in a chair and can't walk doesn't mean I can't learn. So that's like the journey of his advocacism. Well, that was not the word I meant to say. Wow, backtrack that. That was the start of his journey for advocating for himself. He got himself in mainstream. He graduated high school. He moved out. He went to community college. He actually worked as an ESL teacher at community college to kind of help pay for his own tuition. And then he ended up transferring to San Francisco State and entering a master's in creative writing. My dad was a prolific writer, loved to write, loved poetry. He published, I think it's like 4 or 5 books that you can find on Amazon or like any of those platforms about like growing up with disability and, things surrounding like funny life stories and like just really good writing, right? There's a ton of books out there that you can look up on Amazon about him. But he, met my mom at the end of high school and they ended up being sweethearts and they got married. And I think he was like 1 class shy of getting his master's completed when he got his job offer. There's been various things in my family like, no, he did get his master's. No, he was 1 class shy. I don't really know. Who knows? But yeah, he ended up fighting for himself and he got his master's and they got married and then they had me. And then he got this really amazing job for Pride Mobility, which is a wheelchair manufacturer in Pennsylvania. They are one of the largest producers of power chairs. And so we moved us across country when I was like 3 or 4. And he started working for his company and he was there ever since. And he climbed the ladder and he worked, like PR for them. He did a bunch of like advocacy work. He used to go and lobby on Capitol Hill for complex rehab technology. And he would take me with him. He used to do trade shows and take me with him. Right. He had this insane life where he never let anything stop him. Like he was like, yeah, I came from a really shitty childhood and yeah, I'm disabled, but who cares? And he did it no matter what. And I think it's amazing to the fact that he took himself out of a really terrible home environment, especially with my mom when everything went sour, and decided that he was just going to raise this, teenage daughter by himself as a single father of cerebral palsy. Like, I cannot imagine the struggles that he must have went through when I was being a little, shithead as a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I wonder if him growing up, how he grew up in the household that he grew up, he might have realized, that he didn't want you to grow up in a similar way, maybe.
No, and I think he definitely had voiced that at some point. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because I feel like we shared this similar resentment and anger towards my mother. And I feel like that's part of why I had that for as long as I did, especially after he passed. I think he tried his hardest to make sure that I grew up with compassion and empathy. And I definitely feel like I did, right? Especially, where I am at this point. But I feel like it was still really hard for him to still not feel that towards his ex-wife. We had that kind of, shared common ground. And I wish that he would have been a little more open with me about that. And we could have processed that together,
Well, so tell me, I know when we talked last time, you mentioned that he would go out in his wheelchair and do all kinds of fun things. And tell me a little bit about that.
Okay. My father loved himself. I'm sorry. I feel bad saying this. I'm sure he's probably like, shut up, Emily. But he wasn't egotistical, but he was a little bit egotistical. And the fact he just thought he was awesome. His phone background, his wallpaper was a photo of himself. But so one of his biggest accomplishments that I kind of forgot to mention earlier, one of his biggest accomplishments is that in his career, he started this website at the time, message board forum, because that was, a thing in the 90s and 2000s called Wheelchair Junkie. And Wheelchair Junkie attracted thousands and millions of these wheelchair users who would come to connect and, ask each other questions. And my father then kind of, grew it even more to then he was, offering advice to all these wheelchair users and sending people free wheelchair parts because that's expensive. And he kind of grew this fan base almost where we would go to abilities expos, which are trade shows for medical based equipment together. And people would be like, oh my God, it's Mark. It's a Wheelchair Junkie in the flesh. I need a photo. How are you? He ended up being this really well-known guy in the disability community that a lot of people looked up to, which is so interesting growing up to, look back because he would spend hours being, at night after coming home from work on this message forum, answering people's messages and giving advice, and he'd take phone calls and all of that. And then it eventually kind of, evolved into then he added a blog portion of it. And you can actually still go read it. It's still up. I have the password and make sure it's still up. And that's Power Chair Diaries. And so then, he had all these, people now following his writing. And it's interesting because in a way, I almost grew up with, the Wheelchair Junkie. That was kind of his nickname. He literally had his own name on a sticker on the side of his wheelchair. It was Marky Smith, Wheelchair Junkie. And and he would sign books that he would send out to people. Yeah, stuff's laughing, but it's true. My dad loved that spotlight but also being that person that people could go to for help and advice. He thrived on that. And I think that's part of where I get that from now, going into that helping profession, where I also thrive on being that person that you can come to for help. But yeah, I grew up in this weird world of, my dad's Wheelchair Junkie, and he would go off to trade shows and do really dumb shit. There's this one trick. He thought he was funny. He was generally a funny guy. He would do this trick where he would eat a cigarette, genuinely chew and eat a cigarette and then blow smoke out. And everyone would be like, no way. But the catch, right, is that it's cold outside because it's the middle of winter and it's 10 degrees. And so he would chew up and eat the cigarette, and then the smoke is just cold air because it's cold outside. But he would, do it in front of all these drunk people who were hanging out after a long day at the trade show, and people loved it. And he thought he was so funny. But
Did he actually swallow the cigarette?
Yes.
Oh, man.
But he also is someone who his favorite drink was Southern Comfort, but he would just do it straight up, not on the rocks, no ice, no nothing. And he'd use it through a straw because he obviously didn't have that coordination to pick up a shot and do it. So he'd stick a little straw in a Southern Comfort shot glass and just suck it up straight.
Did you ever see your dad driving drunk in his wheelchair?
Oh my God, yeah. At the time, I was just la la la. But then years later, he's yeah, no, I was drunk. I've definitely once or twice have seen that, I'm sure.
Well, I did kind of wonder because you said he came from an alcoholic background.
Yeah, he barely ever touched alcohol, but once in a blue moon, right? Especially at a trade show or something, he would be I can have a little shot, it's okay. But he was very serious about that towards me growing up of we don't smoke, we don't drink, there's none of that,
Okay. And how are you living your life now?
Yeah, I mean, I am very, very aware of the fact that both sides of my family, right, kind of suffer from addiction in that way. And so I don't really drink. I mean, I like a margarita once in a while, but I'm not a big fan of like hard liquor or anything like that. Like I've never touched marijuana or cigarettes or anything like that. I think when you have that predisposition a little bit, knowing that it's in your family, it makes you hyper aware of the fact that I don't want to go down this slope. So I'm just going to try and kind of keep my balance with it, you know?
Yeah.
So part of what my dad would do too is that he had probably like these 3 massive plastic bins full of anything and everything he's ever written and published. Because he like had columns in a bunch of various, like medical and disability magazines, and he had a couple like newspaper article features on him and things like that. And so anytime something like that would happen, he would get a physical copy and put it away in this bin. And so by the time he passed away, he had these, 3 huge bins full of writing. And so after he passed, I sat down on my living room floor and started going through them and discovered writing from when he was like 20 and, in his undergrad, like, these beautiful poems that he wrote to my mom at the time or class assignments that he failed and things like that. And so I got to kind of, see his journey from, being 18 to where he was at 47 and kind of that writing journey in between and how he failed for a lot of it. I think as any other writer kind of starts out, right, you're getting rejected from book deals and assignments could be better and things like that. But so it was so neat to me to sit there and just kind of see his journey evolve from where he started to where, he was when he passed.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are you a writer?
Kind of. I really enjoy writing. I tend to only do it when the inspiration kind of, sparks a little bit. But I do have a blog that I sometimes will post to when the inspiration hits. And a lot of it's been about kind of my grieving process since my dad died. But I actually did post a couple of articles on his blog that you'll see if you visit it. Things like that.
Okay, well, I'm going to put his blog on here. And now that you just told me I didn't know that. We didn't talk about your blog. So yeah. Do you want to share how we can get to your blog?
Yeah. So mine is just transitionalwritings.wordpress.com. Okay. It's a lot about like grief and mourning and kind of moving through that. So if you're interested in that, there you go.
Yeah, definitely. We'll check that out. I don't know. I just really feel like your schooling and your knowledge that you're gaining as you go is really important and is going to help you as you go.
No, yeah. So it's funny, since the last time we talked, I am going into my final year of my clinical schooling, and I just accepted a position working next year with a grief and trauma center here in DC. So I'm going to be like a grief therapist, which is mildly terrifying, but also exciting at the same time for me.
Yes, that's super exciting. Will you be working with like adults and children or just?
Yeah, adults, families, children, because they do, one-on-one individual and family counseling, but they also do like a school and community-based program for kids in the community who have faced like loss and death and traumatic events. So it's like that whole range there I will be hands-on doing.
Do you have any favorite resources, books, podcasts, anything that you think that people dealing with grief and trauma should check out?
I love reading grief books. Like that is like my favorite pastime since my dad died. I have like a whole bookcase on them. And so it's really hard for me to think of just one. In particular though, for those that are in like their 20s and 30s, because obviously, right, I'm a little bit different versus someone who's 50 right now. The Dinner Party. Phenomenal organization. They host virtual tables now, due to pandemic, where you can kind of sign up and meet other people your age who are also grieving, and they have very specific tables. So if, you want a specific table to homicide loss, there you go. If you want a specific, join a specific table to dual parent loss like me, there you go. Things like that. They're a great organization. Modern Loss, I know, is another one that I really enjoy. They do like therapeutic support groups, and they do put out a lot of grief resources. Those are the 2 off the top of my head that I can think of.
We'll be right back.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please consider sharing the show with a friend or rating and reviewing wherever you're listening right now. This will help get the word out about the show, and if one person can be helped by listening to someone's story here, that is amazing. If you would like to share your story with me, you can visit the website at www.backhomemedia.com/parentlesspodcast. You can also email me at parentlesspodcast@gmail.com. Another way to get a hold of me is to find me on Instagram or Facebook, also at Parentless Podcast. And lastly, if you're a phone person, please leave me a voicemail at 623-396-6069. If you love the show and you'd like to help with any special projects that might go on at Parentless Podcast or just be privy to some special extras, go ahead and visit patreon.com/parentlesspodcast. I don't know that we got to talk about this one very much last time, but you told me, ask me about music with my parents. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So especially with my dad, I mean, I know I mentioned my mom, I grew up listening to like Bon Jovi 24/7, but my father really, really loved listening to music. And some of my fondest memories with him, are he would go through these like phases in terms of like, specific items of clothing he would dress, or he would be fixated on he had like a man crush at the time and things like that. And so at one point, right, we would use wheelchair vans because he was in a wheelchair, and he got this like brand new wheelchair van, and he was like dead set on making sure it always looked fantastic, like wash it, wax it. We'd use like chrome cleaner on the wheels, make it all shiny and new. And so growing up for a while, that would be like a weekend activity we would do where he would be like, let's go wash the van today. And he'd like sit there and I'd be like, all right, I'm waxing it, not enjoying it. But in reality, it was actually like, I look back and they're like one of the fondest memories I have, because what we would do is we would, crank up the stereo and have these like father-daughter talks. And he would introduce me to all these different types of music that he loved. He was super into like 90s, alternative rock. And so I grew up on like Weezer and Green Day and Nirvana and The Offspring. And I never got over that. I grew up on that music. It reminds me of my dad deeply, and all of these memories that, we have together, just hanging out, cleaning the house, doing whatever project it was that day. And so for Christmas, my stepmom actually got me a record player. And so I'm trying to think what the vinyls that she gave me were. She got me, my first vinyl for that was a Weezer record. And it's like near and dear to my heart because, I grew up on Weezer. And for Father's Day in 2015, I actually took my dad to see Weezer live in concert. Like we had this, this shared love of this music together that I grew up on. And so it's really remarkable for me to be able to, now I have all of, this whole collection of like Green Day and Nirvana records and Beastie Boys. And I can, pop one on when I'm feeling extra sad that day and think of my dad.
So out of those, did he have like a favorite song that you remember?
That's a great question. He really loved Green Day and Weezer. And in particular, I don't know if anyone knows the Sweater song by Weezer. But it's like, if you want to destroy my sweater, I'm not going to sing it because I'm a terrible singer, but that he loved that one in particular too. Beastie Boys, like Fight for Your Right to Party, things like that.
Was there any particular smell, sight, taste, sound besides music?
Grilled cheese, which is interesting because my father was the type that we'd go to fancy restaurants, right? And he'd be like, hey, can you make me a grilled cheese? And they'd be like, we don't have that on the menu. And he would be like, well, do you have cheese? Yeah. Do you have, 2 slices of bread? Yeah. Then you can make me a grilled cheese. And so that's what they would do, like my dad was a very simple man in terms of that kind of thing. But yeah, like grilled cheese. A good story is that when he was in hospice, he did in-home hospice, and kind of, before he passed away, he was bedridden, the whole thing. And, he was obviously on a lot of painkillers and, trying to get him comfortable. And my stepmom's best friend, Wendy, she's actually a bereavement coordinator at a hospice over in California, came out to kind of, be with us during this hard time. And she, sitting next to my dad at some point, and it's Pennsylvania in November. So there's a huge snowstorm outside. And my dad's like, Wendy. She's like, what is it, Mark? What do you need? And he's like, I really want a blue slushie. And my dad loves slushies. And so she's like, all right. and she bundles up, as in as many jackets as she can, and walks her way down in the middle of a snowstorm to the sheets that's like down this hill behind her house, and gets him a blue slushie. And he never drank it, right? Because he was sleeping and he was, whatever. But it sat I'm not going to lie, it sat in his little mini freezer by his bed for like months after he passed. But now I always have to get a blue slushie on like his birthday or his death and his death anniversary, or whenever I'm just feeling extra sad. I'm like, I'm just going to get a blue slushie and listen to some Weezer.
Is there anything else that you do to remember him on those special days?
Yeah. So particularly with the death anniversary, right? It's only been 2, still kind of new, but what me and my stepmom and stepsister have done is that we'll go and get like those Chinese lanterns and we write messages to him. And then we'll go to the lake that we used to go to as a family by our house, and we'll, light them up and send them into the sky. And it's kind of like, here's a message to, Dad and Mark up in heaven. And so we do that every death anniversary, which is really nice.
And you said November 25th, right?
Yes.
So has that fallen on Thanksgiving yet for you?
It actually is going to this year. So his 3rd death anniversary will fall on Thanksgiving. Yeah, this past Thanksgiving, it was the day before. And obviously, and when he passed away, it was like the day or 2 after.
How has that changed your Thanksgiving?
I definitely think it's a lot more. I mean, we were kind of a small family to begin with, so it was always been kind of low key, but I definitely think there's kind of that, like melancholy feeling for us of Mark's not here, Dad's not here, right? It's not the same. And I think everyone can kind of vouch for that, right? Especially at holidays or birthdays and things like that, where there's always going to be that empty seat at the table. And I think part of that, though, is acknowledging that. Like me and my stepmother will sit there and cry together on Thanksgiving about how much we miss Mark.
Do you want to talk about your dad's sickness and what led up to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, so he always had issues with his esophagus. He had a herniated esophagus, never really took care of it. Let's be honest here. He didn't really like doctors and dentists and things like that. So, but to be fair.
What is a herniated esophagus?
Yes.
Look like, deal with, what happens? That sounds horrible.
It's like, I'm trying to think, how do I even explain this to you? Yeah, it's basically where like your stomach kind of like pushes up through the diaphragm muscle, like in your, like where it connects. And so it's like stomach acid can kind of creep its way up. So like he would aspirate. It's almost like there's like, I don't want to say there's a hole kind of there, but it's like this weird thing where like your diaphragmatic muscle with your stomach and your esophagus open and close like involuntary. And so he would aspirate in his sleep a lot, where stomach acid would come up, right? And he'd wake up and be like, oh God, why is there, like stomach acid in my throat, and having to like throw it up type thing. So he dealt with that for many, many years. And so just never had surgery for it. I don't know. He was not a big fan of doctors and dentists, but to be fair, not many medical professionals genuinely know how to handle cerebral palsy. He would, and like if he had to go sit in the dentist chair, he had to be sedated for that. Like if he needed an X-ray or MRI, he had to be sedated for that, because he couldn't keep still. He'd have muscle spasms and things like that. So it was really hard for him medically to kind of do anything. But so he just take medication to, help the aspiration, call it a day. But so then I want to say it's like September, I think, 2017, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And so he went through a couple rounds of chemo. And then I want to say March or April, February, March. I swear, time just blurs at some point when people pass. But I want to say February, March 2018, he had surgery. And what they did was they went in and they cut out the tumors on the esophagus, but that was like half of his esophagus. So they cut out like half of his esophagus and then pulled his stomach up to what was left of his esophagus. But that surgery kind of went awry, and like his like lungs collapsed or something during that surgery. And so he ended up with a tracheotomy. And that's where they make an incision through your neck to your windpipe and like put this little tube in there so there's literally a hole to breathe. So he woke up from a super serious surgery and he had this this tracheotomy in his neck, and he couldn't talk for a few days. So you have to learn how to talk with them. And that was kind of a really traumatic experience for everyone involved. And so then, he had that tracheotomy and then was in the hospital for a few weeks recovering. And, recovery was really, really hard for him because medical professionals don't know how to handle cerebral palsy most of the time like that. So we were actually on shifts. My stepmother would go during the day, and then I would spend the night there with him. And, he'd wake up in pain and he couldn't really talk. And nurses would be like, we don't know what to do. And I'd be like, nope, like here's what you do. Like, it's still a human being, So that was really, really hard on him. But so eventually he spent his last birthday in the hospital, which really sucks to think about. But so, yeah, he had his birthday in the hospital and everything. And then he got discharged. And then he wasn't the same after that. He couldn't eat as much. It was painful to eat for him. Soon enough, he started, having like really extreme lower back pain, and, pain kind of ended up throughout his whole body. And so he went back to the doctor and they did a scan and they were like, oh, it appears that, you have cancer or tumors like on your liver and, other parts of the body. It's spread. And so this is another kind of aspect of, we feel like a little bit that the medical system failed us in terms that they were like, we're going to do a biopsy, and they tried to do a biopsy and they couldn't get it. And so they wanted to like reschedule us again and try something else. And by that point, my dad was like, I don't have it in me. He's in so much pain, right? They want to sedate him and put his body through all of this, other traumatic stress that he just can't handle at this point. And so that was in October that, it was around Halloween. My stepmother calls me and she's like, hey, your father's going to hospice. You need to come home. And I was like, oh shit, but so, I go home and for a little while there, and I think it was just, she didn't want to face the reality of it. As my stepmother was like, no, he's just in hospice to get pain under control. It's going to be okay. And, we were all like, no, this is it. It's hard to come to terms with. And so that I think was really, really hard for my stepmother in particular. She was losing her husband, and they had thrown me together. I'm trying to think. They got married in 2016. They were only together like 5 years at that point. And so I can't even imagine being my stepmother, dealing and grieving the loss of her husband. I mean, that's a whole nother thing we can talk about. Yeah. So he ended up in hospice, and he was in hospice for probably like a month or so, and, just getting pain management. Luckily he did in-home hospice. So he passed away in his bed. And what's really moving for me to kind of, hear about and tell others is that I truly believe that people choose when they go. And so my father genuinely held on until the very last second that he could. Like he was unconscious for a few days before he passed. And the night he did pass, I was like really overly frustrated, with just annoyed. I was like, at some point, right? I think when you're going through this for so long, you're like, please just let go already. And I don't necessarily feel bad for saying that, because I think that's the reality of it, is that when you're, you've been in this for 2 months and he's barely hanging on, and I'm like, just let go. Like, it's okay. And so I was really stressed out that night, feeling like that. And I went to bed, and then, my stepmother we were all just kind of at our wits' end at this point this night. But then, so, I'm asleep, and then she goes to sleep and she falls asleep holding his hand. And then she woke up about 3 hours later and he had passed. But he passed in his, we were all sound asleep. Everything was calm. He was holding her hand when he decided to let go. And I think that's such a moving image to think about, right? That in your final moments, you're genuinely surrounded by love and calmness. The nice thing is that my stepmother's friends kind of rotated that last month, and they're all in California and Seattle and other places. And so she had like a rotation of people coming in to help us, so we weren't alone during this time. So her friend Heather was there when he did pass. And so me and my stepmom just went downstairs and sat on the couch, and her friend Heather did the rest. She called hospice, and they called the transport in, and she was like, don't look, and it's like, I can vividly remember just me and my stepmother sitting there on the couch. We were like totally silent. I'm just like numb inside. I can just hear like, the sound of the gurney going down the steps. I know, I'm sorry, but it's things we don't talk about. I think especially for the first few months, and I know you kind of mentioned this before in another podcast interview you did, where death, and especially when you kind of witness it or you're there for someone's, last breath, is really traumatic. And people don't want to acknowledge that it's trauma. Like, I have trauma from my dad's passing and my mom's, but there's trauma there for me. And so after my father died for a while, I was like trying to like figure out what can I do to help myself focus. And, and I went to yoga for a little bit, and part of that yoga class was they did like a little sound bowl meditation at the end, and you'd lay there and you could like fall asleep, and they did the sound bowl, and it's nice and calming. When I was, laying there and I closed my eyes, And my trauma at that time decided it was going to rear its head, and they're playing the sound bowl, and I'm laying there, and all of a sudden I hear the gurney sound, and then I just see the image in my head of my father's body, because I was there. I went and said goodbye to him after he had passed, right? So I have that image of my lifeless dad's body in the bed. And I had a full-blown panic attack at the end of his yoga class and ran out, and I've never gone back to yoga since.
The things that we don't really think about, and like you said, we don't talk about. And so that's why I think it is important to anybody who's open to talk about that stuff. I think it's totally important so that we know that it does happen. It happens to a lot of people, and it's okay to talk about it. Yeah. So are you going to be trying yoga in the future?
Not right now. Yeah, it's that was in itself a traumatic event for me almost, I'm now I associate that with that specific memory. So it's something I need to work through.
Yeah, I don't think you should push yourself. That was a facetious question. I don't think you should try yoga.
No, you're fine. I mean, but that brings up, I've been very much lately kind of diving into how we kind of keep trauma and stress and grief in our bodies. For everyone out there, if you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel, what's his name? Hold on. I always pronounce it. It's Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk or something like that. Sorry, dude, probably pronounced his name wrong. But Body Keeps the Score. It's an amazing book about how you kind of, keep that stress and that trauma in your body and how it manifests. And it can actually lead to things like heart disease and cancer, all of these terrible diseases. And so that's been a lot of, how do you move grief and trauma through your body? And that's been something I've been kind of looking at. And a huge thing for a lot of people has been meditation.
Have you tried that?
I have a little bit. I recently attended a bereavement workshop with Wendy, kind of, I guess I would call her a step on at this point. Right. But, my friend Wendy, she's a bereavement coordinator. And so she actually ran a bereavement workshop that me and my stepmom attended together. And they did a couple about, moving your grief through meditation and deep breathing type of thing. And it was okay. I don't know. I feel like for me, I can definitely kind of pinpoint now how it manifests, especially with important dates. So 3 weeks ago was my birthday, but what people don't necessarily, always know is that my father's birthday is the day before mine. His is March 2nd and mine's March 3rd. So we kind of always shared a birthday. And so ever since he passed, right, that kind of week has always been really, really hard for me. And my birthday just hasn't exactly been the same. And so 3 weeks ago, right, it's the end of February. And I'm man, I'm getting headaches every day this week and my back's aching. And then, the little light bulb went off and I was oh, right. My dad's birthday's in 2 days. And I was oh, that's why I'm exhausted and in so much pain because, even if you don't consciously think about it, you're still thinking about it subconsciously, and your body knows. Mm-hmm. So I had that experience of oh, my body is keeping the score and I wish it would stop right now.
Tell me about your career path and how your dad's death may have impacted that.
Yeah. So it's funny because in high school, I was I'm going to be a therapist and I'm going to help people. And I was specifically dead set on mental health and addiction at the time because of my mom. And then I went off to college and my undergrad is a bachelor's in psychology. But then I still work at the agency that I work at now, and they provide services to, special needs children and their families. We specifically tend to kind of work with kids, with autism spectrum disorder. And so I started doing that in undergrad and I was wow, I really love this. And I got really passionate about, ensuring that these kids had the same resources and access that they, as their peers in public school. And I got really fired up about that. And so I ended up enrolling my last year of undergrad in an accelerated master's program for special education, thinking I could go into public school and, change the system, which is not how that works. I'm sorry to say. But so that was, I kind of shifted gear paths a little bit. I had about a semester of that under my belt. And then my dad passed away. And my dad passed away 23 days before I was set to graduate. So that was a whole nother thing, right? Of here's this, huge milestone in my life where I'm graduating college and have to figure out where I want to go from there. And my dad just died. And so he died. And I was nope, this isn't for me anyway. And I dropped out of that master's and I went right back to my original plan, and I ended up enrolling in a clinical Master's of Social Work program here in DC at Catholic University. And I'm 2 years into that. I have one more year to go because I'm doing it part-time because I also work full-time, and I've loved it so far. And I think part of that was what I was meant to do from the start. And I kind of knew that, in high school, got a little derailed for a minute there, but then my dad put me right back on track.
Love it. Well, you were 23 days and you would have been done.
Yep.
What is one thing that you would, or one thing or some things that you would want to say to your mom?
Yes, it's hard. I think separately, I think for my mom especially, it's just that, I think I would just apologize to her, right? I'm sorry that I couldn't cognitively process, what you were going through, and that I didn't have that, that compassion and that empathy and that understanding, but I do now. And I sincerely do wish that I had that prior to her death. I feel like things maybe could have been different, or they could have been the same. That's the hard part of it, is those what ifs, and you're never going to know. Mm-hmm. I think for my dad, he used to always say, I love you more than words to me. And I think just in general, when people pass, you tend to have guilt and remorse, and you kind of work through that. And part of me has that for both my parents in kind of separate ways. And I definitely know that, right, we were so close when I was in high school, and then I went off to college, and part of college is finding yourself. And so, I kind of was in my phase of college of I'm hanging out at school and getting a job and dating people. And so I was like, yeah, Dad, I'm fine. Don't worry about me, and I feel like our relationship dynamic definitely shifted a little bit. And then he got sick, and I was like, he's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And he wasn't fine. And I wish I can kind of go back and maybe have stopped that dynamic shift a little bit. I don't know. I feel like that's also part of just being a teenager and being in your 20s is where you're finding yourself. And, that relationship does change, especially when you go off 5 hours away in another state to college. But part of me wishes that I was a little more cognitive about that because I definitely have a lot of guilt and remorse for, certain how I acted, I think, when I was 21, skipping, I didn't go home for Christmas one year and birthday, I don't know, things like that. There's different things I feel like I would change about how I acted. And I wish I could apologize to him for that.
What is something that you realize now?
I have created this little metaphor for myself that I love to tell people, where grief comes in and it makes its own little house in your life. Okay. And so when I was first grieving, I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to get through this. This is so painful. And it still is, right? I mean, that never goes away. But I think that grief truly does evolve and kind of becomes a part of you in your journey. And it makes its own little home in your life. I kind of, I like to say my grief has a house. And it has a couple different rooms, and sometimes it'll come in and it'll redecorate or add things to the walls. And, then my mom passed away, and I was like, oh, grief's here, and it's building on an extension to the house now, and there's new rooms and things on the walls, and it's gonna shift and it's gonna change, and the house is gonna get updated every few years, as a house would. But that's okay. I mean, that's a part of the journey, right? I mean, grief truly does evolve with you and becomes a part of you, and there's never moving on and getting through it, right? It's always kind of going to be there in the back, whether you acknowledge it or not. And part of it is allowing yourself to sit there and feel it and sit in your grief. And I feel like, especially in the clinical setting, a lot of times, right, therapists or other, behavioral health workers will be like, well, this is too intense. You need to take a step back, just journal, just meditate. And it's no, the reality is that you should allow yourself that space to sit in your grief and be really upset and cry and be angry for a day, because that's normal. That's part of the process. And I think for me, when I first started, I was like, nope, I'm fine. And I'm very much someone who's a doer when things like that happens. So for the first month that my dad passed, I was like, I'm just going to plan his memorial and get him cremated. And I have to finish school and do and go. And I didn't really allow myself that space to sit there and grieve. And now I'm 2 years out, but I'm making sure that, I'm allowing myself that space to grieve, and I'll make sure to do that in 20 years from now.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for stopping by Parentless Podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
If you'd like to hear the rest of Emily's interview, please check it out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/parentlesspodcast. After we talked, Emily was inspired to create the Young Grievers Club, a support group for 18 to 30-year-olds grieving the loss of a parent or a parental figure. If you'd like to be part of the group, please let Emily or myself know, and we will get you into that group. Parentless Podcast is recorded in Phoenix, Arizona. Find us on social media and most major podcast platforms. Music provided by Colin the Coco and the Revolving Birds. Studio and editing provided by Back Home Media. Check out one of the many shows on our network. I am your host, Stephanie Rilliford.